Good evening once again. We are thrilled to be joined tonight by synagogues, universities, schools, and other organizations from all over the area to mark 82 years since the November 9th pogroms that targeted the Jewish communities across Germany and Austria. The night of Kristallnacht sent fear and terror throughout the world and truly showed the extreme horror that the Nazi regime was capable of carrying forth in their war against the Jews of Europe. As we gather here tonight with so many people from all areas of Greater Metro West and beyond, we do so and remember all those lives that were lost on Kristallnacht and during the Holocaust. We remember the men, women, and children, the grandparents, mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons, cousins, aunts, uncles, and friends. And we remember the generations that never came to be. In their memory, we will keep this yurtzeit candle lit as we listen tonight and learn together. We often speak of the power of one, whether that be the power of one to survive, the power of one to stand up to what is right, the power of one to help those in need, and sadly, oftentimes, the power of one that has done wrong, the power of one to incite hatred. Never was the power of one so strong as during the Holocaust, when a decision of a split second could save or end a life, when the power of one meant so much to so many. I am privileged this evening to introduce to you Arno Michalis, who will share his incredible story, a story of the power of one, a story of how one could be filled with hatred and then be filled with so much goodness. The power of one to emerge from the depths of the white supremacists and the neo-Nazi movement, to tell his story and impart on others his new mission, his new purpose, to forgive, to move forward, and to live a life without hatred. The atrocities of November 9th and 10th, 1938 would never have taken place for not the power of one to incite hatred. And had more individuals had the strength and perseverance of Arno to stand up to hatred, so many more could have been saved. As we listen to the powerful messages of Arno this evening, I ask each of you to think about that power of the individual and remember all those that did what was right, that helped and aided those in need. For it is the power of those remarkable souls that we should never forget. While we never want to forget all that was destroyed during Kristallnacht, let's also remember all the good that can come from living a life beyond hatred. After Arno speaks, we will have time for questions. You can put them directly in the chat to me and I will read them. Thank you again for joining us. Arno?
Thank you, Elise. Thank you, David. Thank you to everybody at the UJA and the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, New Jersey. I'm very grateful that you all brought me to share this evening with you tonight, and I'm especially grateful for the service to our community that you've all been so diligently doing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thinking of Kristallnacht, I recall my visit to Auschwitz in 2015. To walk in a place where every speck of dirt and every blade of grass and every drop of water is infused with the physical remains of millions of people who were systematically murdered because of their faith, because of who they were, because of their culture, and because of the sheer hatred and ignorance of one vile ideology that drove so many German people to not only commit these acts of murder, but to turn a blind eye when they knew that other people were committing it. I think about the rooms when you walk through Auschwitz and you see a room full of eyeglasses. And I remembered when I was a kid and I was on a boat that a dad's friend of mine had, and we're out on Lake Michigan, and my parents heard me complaining I couldn't read something, and my mom asked me to read the letters on a sailboat sail that was not too far away. And that's how we figured out that I needed glasses. And looking at this gigantic pile of glasses, I thought how there's a story behind every one of those pairs of glasses. There was a moment when the person who those glasses belonged to realized that they needed something to help themselves see. And that every one of those pairs of glasses represented a life that was so brutally and prematurely ended for such a senseless reason. I recall the room full of pots and pans and looking at those pots and pans and thinking about the meals that were cooked within them and the families that gathered to enjoy those meals. My mom has this old battered pot that she's had since college that we used to make popcorn and mashed potatoes specifically. And over the years, I lost count how many times my family sat to eat popcorn out of that pot. And mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving and Christmas and special times. And every single one of those pots at Auschwitz has stories behind it as well. But the people involved in those stories are no longer with us, which is why it's so important to keep those stories alive. The stories that you may have in your own family, the stories that you've heard from Holocaust survivors. And Kristallnacht was the beginning of all of that. It was the catalyst that led to the murder of over 6 million Jews and countless other people who were murdered because of their politics or their skin color or their sexuality. And as I think about all that, I remind myself that there was a time in my life, 7 years specifically, when I was a vehement denier that any of that ever happened. And I say that with shame. I'm humiliated that I ever held that frame of mind. I feel just devastated to even imagine how it would feel to someone who survived that or someone who lost a family member to hear someone deny that it ever happened. And not only to deny it, but to then assign some kind of nefarious plot towards the entire fact of the Holocaust. It's horrific. But that, as humiliated as I feel by admitting that, it's also an important part of my healing process, is to be accountable for the harm that I've done to the world. And Holocaust denial is sadly a small part of that. I was a leader and organizer of neo-Nazi hate groups for 7 years, from 1987 to 1994. I have a natural leadership ability. I had a talent for getting other broken, angry, pissed off white kids around me and winding them up to set loose on society, to hate people and to hurt people. I don't have a lick of musical talent, but I was good at screaming really loud and getting on stage and getting people crazy. And I had done that in the punk rock space for a couple of years before I was exposed to white nationalism through white power music. And so one of the first things I did when my friends and I started a white power gang was start our own white power skinhead band. And we started writing songs that said everything wrong in our lives was the fault of Jewish people and of black people and gay people and anybody else who didn't look like us. We hated white people as well, actually. Any white people who weren't expressly with us were seen as traitors. And actually, they were the highest order of enemy because we felt that they had no excuse for the way they behaved. And as we had this long list of people we hated, at the top of that list, right above Jewish people, was the white race traitor. And that's how I saw the world for 7 years. And I grew up in a way that wouldn't lead you to think that I'd end up like that. I've done a lot of work in this space. It's called counter-violent extremism, and I've been working in it internationally for a decade. I've had the good fortune to travel the world and work with amazing people of every background you can imagine. And I also work with a ton of former violent extremists like myself. and not just former white nationalists, but former members of ISIS, former members of Al Qaeda, former Antifa. I have dear friends who were former militants on both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And learning from my peers and colleagues all over the world and listening to their stories, it's kind of a common thing that a lot of people who get involved in violent extremism had a very rough childhood in one way or another. My childhood from the surface was pretty idyllic. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, pretty well-to-do suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, about 15 miles north along the shores of Lake Michigan. I never went hungry. I never took a beating. My parents were together. They loved me very, very much, and they let me know that at every turn. In fact, all of the adults in my life as I grew up like fawned on me. I was this golden boy. They'd say, he's so wonderful. He's so gifted. He's so special. He can do anything he wants to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But looking back, and this is all like Monday morning psychoanalysis, like looking back at my life and trying to figure out where things went wrong. I've come up with the theory that because of my father's drinking and the stress it put on my mother, I suffered as a kid. And I suffered because I saw my mom suffer. Now, my father was not a violent drunk. He was a fun drunk, actually. And when my dad was drunk, we were going to shoot guns and light out fireworks, which to me, I was great. What little boy wouldn't love that? I have friends who remind me, like, Arno, that's not normal, actually. Most people, their dads don't have them shoot pistols in the basement and light out fireworks in the backyard. But be that as it may, I love my dad, and I knew he loved me. But his drinking made my mom's life very difficult. And there were times when she had to work 2 jobs. They'd pay the bills and keep food on the table in her nice house in a nice neighborhood. And their relationships sucked. The financial stresses and the drinking just had them fighting constantly. And I knew my mom was suffering. And rather than be a good kid and be like, hey, Mom, I love you. How can I help? I just started to distance myself from her and from my dad, who loved me very much, despite the disease he struggled with. And of course, as I distanced myself from my parents and from other adults in my life who loved me and wanted to help me, go figure, my suffering got worse. And I expressed that suffering by lashing out at other kids. My younger brother was the first victim of my bullying. And as soon as I started going to school, I would pick a target arbitrarily out of my peers at school and bully other kids. I started out as a bully on the school bus in kindergarten, and I started to get a thrill from causing havoc, from disrupting the course of day-to-day life. I remember the kid on the bus that I used to beat up, his mom getting on the bus and yelling at me. And I was hiding behind the back seat, and she'd say, I see you back there, Arnie Michaelis, you leave my son alone. And it was just like a rush. I was like, oh, she's really mad. Like the whole world's stopping. I felt a sense of control, and I felt a sense of power, and I wanted more of it. And I found in my work in counterviolent extremism, there are a ton of parallels between addiction and violent extremism. Being an alcoholic myself, as well as a former violent extremist, I can speak with authority from both places. And the first commonality that comes up when telling my story is that when you abuse a substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs, the amount of that substance it takes to get high the first time needs to increase to get that same kind of high. So for instance, when I started drinking at age 14, I think I drank 4 or 5 beers and I passed out. By the time I quit drinking in 2004, I could drink 18 beers in an evening and still function the next day. And that's an example of how the amount of that substance needs to increase to get the same effect. My antisocial behavior was the same way. So as I grew older, it was no longer a thrill to beat up this one kid on the bus. So I got a bunch of kids on the bus to beat them up. When that was no longer a thrill, I'd get in fights in the schoolyard. I graduated to breaking and entering, to burglary, to vandalism. Started drinking at age 14. The alcohol was very much gasoline on the fire that I was already burning in my addiction to lashing out. I got into punk rock, which I still absolutely love. I don't want to make it sound like punk is some kind of gateway drug to becoming a white nationalist. But at the same time, like, punk means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And to me, punk was just about breaking things. It was about repulsing civil society. In the late 80s, I had a mohawk hairdo, big high one, when I put stuff into it to make it stick up. And nowadays, mohawks are kind of passe. It's, you know, ball players had them, gone here and there. There are people in a chocolate chip cookie commercial with a mohawk. It's not a big deal anymore. But in the late 80s, if you walked around with a mohawk, like, you were liable to, somebody would pick a fight with you because you look so outlandish according to the norm of the time. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to provoke that fight. I wanted to provoke that kind of reaction. Well, if you think a mohawk repulses people, try a swastika. Swastikas really repulse people. And I wasn't ignorant as to why. I grew up with Jewish friends. The city I grew up in, Mequon, has a huge Jewish population. And I had Jewish friends throughout my childhood growing up. I've been to a bunch of bat mitzvahs, a bunch of bar mitzvahs. I never had a bad experience with a Jewish person. And it's important to say that had I, that's by no means any excuse for anti-Semitism, but it was really just the thrill of lashing out and the horror that swastika evoked, and the power that I felt upon evoking that horror. I knew about the Holocaust. I knew that it had happened. I was not versed in any of the Holocaust denial ideology and false misinformation. But all I knew was that it enraged people. And looking back again in Monday morning psychoanalysis, I think that I hated myself. And going back to when I was a little kid and people would tell me how great I was inside feeling like I'm not great. I'm horrible. And if you don't believe how horrible I am, watch what I'm going to do to this kid on the bus. Watch what I'm going to do to this classroom. Watch what I'm going to do to the snack shack at the country club, my first burglary and breaking and entering victim. Watch what I'm going to do to this society when I adopt this swastika as my identity and I go running amok with it. That's how it happened. There wasn't any rhyme or reason to it. It was just because it made people angry. Now, as my friends and I adopted this hate and violence as an ideology and an identity, and we radiated it into the world reflected it back to us in no uncertain terms. And we saw the hate and violence come back at us. Within 6 months, my best friend that I started the gang with and started a band with, he played guitar. He went to prison for shooting some kid that came to do a drive-by in our house. Within a couple of years, another very close friend of mine who we shared a birthday with, he was exactly 1 year younger than me, he was shot and killed in a street fight as he was out drunk and picking fights. And rather than take this misfortune that we brought upon ourselves as a wake-up call to say, hey, maybe we should be doing something different, we spun it to fit the ideology that the world was out to get us. And by the world, I mean the Jews. It was this ominous Jewish conspiracy to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. And that's why my friend went to prison. It wasn't because he shot this kid. It was because the Jews wanted to take us out. My friend who was shot and killed picking fights in the street, it wasn't because he was drunk and picking fights. It was because the Jews brought all these non-white people, all the Mexicans, all the blacks here. That's why they were here to destroy the white race. And now my dear friend and comrade in this racial holy war is a casualty. That's how we spun every misfortune that we brought upon ourselves. Now, ironically, that spin was a big part of the exhaustion that led me to leave white nationalist hate groups in 1994. The most frequently asked question I get, and I'm sorry if it takes anybody's question out of the mix here, but is like, how did you change? What made you change? The simple word is exhaustion. It was exhausting to act that way. It's exhausting to hate people. It was exhausting to run around with that swastika knowing why people hated the swastika, why people were horrified by it. I knew why they were. I knew about the Holocaust. It was exhausting hurting people with my bare hands when they hadn't done anything to me. And all along, there's this inner voice saying, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? And I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that inner voice, much less answer it. So I had to expend a ton of energy to deny this deep inner knowledge of what I was doing was wrong. I had to spend a ton of energy to spin every event in my day-to-day life to suit this white nationalist narrative, which is contradicted by every event in day-to-day life. So I'm constantly in this mode where I'm like, oh no, that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is this. I had to find some way to blame everything that was going wrong in my life that was my fault on Jewish people that I had never met and frankly didn't really know a whole lot about. That was incredibly exhausting. I grew up a complete film, TV, sports, and music geek, and I still am. I love all those things on a daily basis. And I grew up loving to read. I loved Hollywood movies, and I love the Green Bay Packers, and I love to watch TV. And according to white nationalist dogma, all of those things are forbidden. And the reason they're forbidden is because they were all Jewish propaganda to make white people complicit in their own destruction. Again, as ridiculous as that should sound to any thinking person, it was literally music to my ears when I was 16 years old. And that's how I got involved in it. But it sucked not being able to root for the Packers anymore publicly around my friends because doing so made me a race traitor. One of the most potent cultural aspects of my turnaround was the TV sitcom Seinfeld. When Seinfeld got really popular in the early 90s, my girlfriend and I loved it as much as anybody else. My girlfriend was part of the skinhead movement and kind of less ideologically sold on it than I was. And she kind of wanted just a normal life. And I think watching Seinfeld was part of that for her. And she worked on Thursday nights when Seinfeld aired at 8 p.m. on NBC. And she would make sure that I taped it for her on her VCR. If I didn't have Seinfeld tape, she would be really angry at me, and I didn't want that to happen. So when she got home, I would actually watch it again, or having already watched it when I taped it, and we would laugh hysterically. We would laugh at every little thing that Seinfeld's come to be iconic in our society for. And Seinfeld being such observational humor, as I was going about my day-to-day life, so I watch it Thursday night, and then on Monday I'm having a bowl of soup, and I'm like, the soup Nazi. Or on Tuesday, if I'm at work and somebody's talking too close to me, I'm like, oh, he's a close talker. And, every little Seinfeld reference you could imagine would bring Seinfeld to mind for me, as it did for so many people who love the show. But in my case, after having a chuckle, I would also have that inner voice say, okay, so does Jerry Seinfeld get to live in your whiter and brighter world? Or if he does, do you think he'd be very funny while you're killing all the other Jews on earth? I knew Seinfeld was like this quintessential example of Jewish humor. And it was a sense of humor that really was rooted in thousands upon thousands of years of persecution. And I didn't have an answer to that question. There is no valid answer to that question. The only answer was that I was full of shit, and that everything I was trying to believe was nonsense, and it was harmful, and it was wrong. So in that way, the sitcom Seinfeld helped to like rub my nose in my wrongness and to show me how much better life would be if I let go of this ideological box I had put myself on and really like open myself up to all these things that I for these baseless reasons claimed were harmful. What was most powerful though was when people I would meet through work or sometimes even a chance encounter at McDonald's, people I claimed to hate would treat me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that happened time and time again throughout the 7 years I was involved in hate groups. There were times when people like a Jewish boss, lesbian supervisor, Black and Latino coworkers refused to capitulate to my hostility and instead demonstrated to me how human beings should treat another human being. In doing so, they were not knuckling under to me. They were not capitulating to me. They were defying me, and they were putting themselves in a position of power. They were dictating the rules of engagement between us in our interaction. Everything that I did back then was meant to provoke hostility. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I'm a gifted genius, like my mom says, and my grandma said, and my dad may even once said that. And as a gifted genius, I thought it'd be really clever to get a swastika tattooed on my middle finger of my right hand. And I did that specifically so that when people got in my face, when people were hostile back to me, they reflected my aggression. I could show them that middle finger in the process of closing that fist and punching them with it. That was by design. It was an extra oomph to be like, if someone's not hostile enough to fight, maybe this will put them over the edge and make them that hostile. Right after I got the tattoo, I was at a McDonald's restaurant, and there was this sweet elderly black woman behind the counter. And as I took my money out of my pocket, she noticed the tattoo, and she said, "What is that on your finger?" And she said it the same way my grandma used to talk to me when I was beating up my little brother. Like, "I love you, but come on now." And I couldn't even answer her. I couldn't look her in the eye. I just looked down at my steel-toed skinhead boots and I just mumbled, "It's nothing." And when I looked up again, she said, "I know that's not who you are. You're a better person than that." That was defiance. That was power. That was resistance to the hate that I emanated. If that woman would have kicked me out of McDonald's and said, "Get out of here, you racist Nazi bastard, don't ever come back," that would have fulfilled everything I was trying to accomplish. Then I could have walked out of there the victim. I could have walked out of there with a sense of persecution, that I'm being oppressed. And of course, it wouldn't have been just the black woman's fault. It would have been Jewish people's fault as well. But rather than fall into that trap, this wise woman working a cash register at McDonald's demonstrated to me how a human being should treat another human being and how a human being should look at another human being. And in doing so, she helped to change the course of my life. All of that exhaustion built and built until I reached a point where I was literally looking for an excuse to leave. And I needed an excuse because I was leaving a pretty drastic double life. In the movement, as we called it, I was like king, rock star, skinhead, war god. I had a band that was very popular. We did groupies, we were partying all the time. Kids all over the world like told stories about fights that I got into. I was a reverend in a racial holy war. I was a founding member of the Hammerskin Nation. I had all this status. In real life, I was a high school dropout alcoholic who was too much of a drunk to pay his bills, so he keep moving back in with his parents. And I had a tendency to drink until I passed out and piss all over myself. Like, that's who I was in real life. And so it was a hard thing to give up all of this and face the cold reality of the miserable life I had made for myself and do something about it. And so it took some pretty drastic things to happen to finally bring me to that point. It came in a two-stage process. In early 1994, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. And I became a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter. A couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight. By that point, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated, and it finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. That gave me the excuse I was looking for to turn my back on that ideology, to turn my back on that miserable way of living. And when I say miserable, I tried to kill myself twice during that 7-year span by slitting my wrists on 2 separate occasions. Both times my life was saved by 2 different skinhead girlfriends who fortunately weren't squeamish at the sight of blood and knew basic first aid enough to keep me from bleeding out. it could be argued that the entire 7-year period was an ongoing suicide attempt because I had absolutely zero regard for my safety. I had been shot at. I had been in ridiculous amounts of violence. I got beat up as often as I beat other people up. And it was all like within any regard for my safety or my future or even my value as a human being. And I think that's what really drove me to attack and hate and hurt other people, is that I didn't value myself. And not only did I not value myself, I hated myself. And I could not come to terms with that. And I couldn't understand where this was coming from. And that's where my hate for everybody else came from, was my inner hatred for myself. I left the skinhead movement in 1994, went on a 7-year rave party bender. I'm a man of extremes, and I went from extreme hate and violence to extreme peace and love, shaking my butt to house music on Sunday morning at 4 a.m. on the south side of Chicago with 4,000 people of every possible background, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic background you can imagine, and loving every minute of it. And I really kind of rebuilt myself during that time as someone who has believed that a spiritual primal love between human beings not only can exist, that does exist, and it's there for us to tap into at any time. I quit drinking in 2004, quit doing drugs at the same time, and I started writing in 2007, which led me to go public with my story on the Martin Luther King holiday of 2010. And I've been doing this for 10 years as of the past MLK holiday. And I can't say how grateful I am to do this work that is basically storytelling. I'm telling my story. I love telling other people's stories. I'm really starting to move into that a lot now. But it's also a lot of listening. And it's a lot of healing. It's understanding the role of trauma in violent extremism, and helping people who are involved in violent extremist groups to understand how the trauma in their life has driven them to where they are, and how to deal with that trauma to get them to let go of that hate, let go of that violence. And interestingly, one of the most powerful ways I found is service. So I was super inspired by the video that you guys showed at the beginning of the session, the service that you all have shown to help not only your own community, but all communities deal with the stress of this pandemic is amazing. And that is the antidote, that is the inoculation, that is what we need as human beings to get us through this very arduous time when we're all kind of walking on eggshells. There's all this uncertainty from the pandemic. Service to each other that's unconditional and done without judgment. It's done simply because people need help, not asking why they need help or who they are. If they get help, they don't get help. Everybody gets help. The example that you are all are setting that regard is amazing, and it resounds in me because that's been a real thrust of my work over the past 10 years, is bringing communities together through service learning and through the arts. And I'm very happy that work had brought me to meet Judy Goff, which I believe was in Montvale or Montville. I just say Montvaleville, actually. That covers both of them. But I'm glad that my path brought me there and connected me with you all here tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Nothing's off limits. More difficult question, the better. And thank you so much for listening to me tonight.
We thank you so much. And we actually have a lot of questions to get to. And so we invite everyone to stay and listen. And we are so glad here at the Jewish Federation and at the Holocaust Council to be able to bring you here to our community today, and that you were able to see some of the work we have been doing, but also that we're able to benefit from your story. So the first question we have, did your parents ever try to intervene at any point? And would that have made any difference? And a side note, that came in from my 10-year-old.
Your 10-year-old is very wise, and I really appreciate the reminder, because I tell this story far too often. focusing on these acts of kindness, and I love to talk about Seinfeld and the Green Bay Packers, but a huge factor in my turnaround was my parents. Both of my parents refused to give up on me. They let me know that they loved me even when they were ashamed of what I was doing and who I had become, and they refused to give up that on the idea that there was something in me worth saving. And because of their love that really only a parent can have, and believe me, I tested them. You guys have no idea. Like just a glimpse is what you got tonight. I be a parent now myself, and my daughter just turned 28. I have a slight idea of what I put my parents through, but my daughter's wonderful, and it's nowhere near as bad as what I did to my parents. But yeah, my parents were a huge factor in my turnaround, and I absolutely could not have done it without them. And they're both huge supporters of mine today. I haven't. Contrary to what a lot of people think, you don't just like bust out and say, "Hey, I used to be a skinhead. When do I go on Oprah and get like big giant speaking engagements in a movie and a book and all that?" It's a very difficult life and career, and without my parents' financial support, I wouldn't have been able to do this work. So to this day, I have them to thank for everything that I do.
Thank you. What form of swastika did you carry or wear? And you explained some of the tattoos, but were they related to then or now, or can you explain one or two of them?
Sure. So there are a number of different forms of swastikas, and it's actually it's an interesting thing in that just about every human culture all over the world kind of independently came up with a swastika-like motif in their spirituality, whether it's Native American or in the Far East. The swastika we're all too familiar with actually came from the old Norse folk religions that Hitler co-opted into the Nazi Germany ideology. But a lot of my tattoos nowadays, and the swastika I got they were really like, not like any swastika looks good, but these were really like dodgy looking homemade, like, it's like you scratched it on a toilet seat or something. It was just uglier than swastikas normally look, put it that way. That was the swastika I had on my middle finger. I've had Celtic crosses on me that were covered up. I had SS bolts that were covered up. But a lot of my tattoos today, and you can't see them. Well, yeah, maybe you can kind of see them. This whole sleeve is all Scandinavian themed artwork. And one of my most recent tattoos are these runes on the side of my hand, which actually might look kind of scary, but it says existence is basically good in Norse runes. And the reason why I got the Norse runes and why I still get all the Viking work is because I want to reclaim my Scandinavian heritage from the white nationalist narrative. And their narrative is a false one. I've been a great scholar of the Viking age. I'm a good chunk Norwegian and the rest Prussian, Northern European. And the truth is that while the Vikings certainly weren't Cub Scouts, they were anything but racist. Yes, they raped and pillaged and looted and enslaved other white people, particularly other Vikings. There's no two countries on earth that have been to war more times than Denmark and Sweden, and Norway comes in there in a close second. But the Vikings had peaceful trade and diplomatic relationships with Arabic people in the Middle East and Black people in Northern Africa. So if the Vikings were really these white warriors that the white nationalists try to make them out to be, why would that be the case? That they traded and had diplomatic relations with Black and brown people, and they actually like killed and enslaved other white people. So my whole arm, this tattoo is to really like connect me to what was really beautiful about the Viking Age. And the Viking culture was a very progressive one. They had one of the truest forms of democracy in human history. They had true gender parity. It's not just a storyline on the Viking show. There was actually women who were leaders and who owned land and who were commanders, and there's a lot of really awesome stuff about being Scandinavian. And I've spent a lot of time in Denmark recently in the past 10 years, as well as Norway. I've also been to Sweden and Finland, not been to Iceland yet, but Scandinavian society nowadays, I think, is it's kind of how grown-ups do society. And I think our society here could take a lot of lessons from them. So that's a lot of what my Viking tattoos are about. And my most recent tattoo is this on the back of this fist. It's the first letter of the Sikh scripture. So in Sikhi, the first word of scripture, the first lines of scripture is that God is truth, God is one, and it means that we're all part of the same divine creation. And Sikhi is very, even though I'm a Buddhist, Sikhi is very inspirational to me because on August 5th of 2012, a guy who was a part of the gang that I helped to start walked into the Sikh temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek, and he murdered 6 people that day. Another person had died since, so he's murdered 7 people. And the last person murdered was a man named Sutwant Singh Kalika. His son Pardeep reached out to me in October of 12, and him and I became very dear friends and brothers. We wrote a book together called The Gift of Our Wounds. And we've been running this service program called Serve to Unite together as well. And through that, I've learned so much about about Sikhi, about the Sikh faith, that's a huge inspiration to me. And that's why I get it tattooed on my body. So a couple shorter tattoo stories there, but I do have a bunch of them everywhere. I could do a whole talk on that, actually.
Thank you. Were you afraid when you were trying to leave the hatred and leave white supremacy behind and leave your group? Did you have fear then?
When I was first leaving, I was not afraid. And I think it was because violence was so ingrained in me that I just didn't fear it at all. Like, I welcome violence. And I think part of the reason why nobody came after me initially was because of my reputation. I think the other thing that worked in my favor is I kind of just disappeared as far as those guys were concerned. I didn't like turn right around at that point and start doing talks for the Holocaust Education Center. I just like disappeared into the rave scene, which, as I mentioned, like largely took place in the south side of Chicago, which is like the last place you're going to find any neo-Nazi skinheads. So I just kind of fell off the face of the earth as far as they were concerned. And that's that combined with my reputation, I think, worked in my favor. And I wasn't, as soon as I got out, I was so happy to be out that you couldn't have set me back with a gun to my head. So I wasn't afraid of them.
We have a lot of people asking about the rise in anti-Semitism today. Obviously, you spoke about the Tree of Life Synagogue. You're clearly aware. Is there something you would like to say or something you could share about your thoughts on how to stop this or change what's going on or things like that in terms of the recent rise of anti-Semitism?
I would emphasize what we had talked about in the earlier session, the private session, in that not just anti-Semites, but any violent extremist has obviously given up their faith in humanity. They have no faith in humanity. They think that people deserve to die, obviously. And by their violent acts, whether it's an attack on the Gurdwara in Oak Creek or attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh or the mosque in Quebec or the mosque in Christchurch, what have you, all of these attacks are meant to destroy people's faith in humanity. And specifically without anti-Semitism, they want Jews to be terrified. They want to strike fear in the heart of every Jew on this planet when they attack a synagogue, whether it's a horrific armed attack like Tree of Life, or if it's just spray paint a swastika. They want to have that kind of power. Don't give it to them. Refuse them that power and say, I'm not going to give up my faith in humanity because of your twisted, miserable actions. You don't deny them that to have that power over you. And unfortunately, that's been the case in response over and over again. It just sucks that response has to be made. I've got to know Rabbi Meyer of Tree of Life, and would see him at events. The last time not the last time, but after I met him the first time, the next time I saw him was in Pittsburgh at a memorial for the Christchurch shooting, and we kind of noted. I said, it's good to see you again, Rabbi. And he said, yeah, I wish we would have different reasons for seeing each other than what's happening. But the message is the same. The message is like, no matter what depths of atrocity human beings will stoop to, the rest of humanity will answer that atrocity with not just an equal, but a greater amount of compassion and example of what's great about humanity in response. And I believe that has happened throughout human history, and it'll continue to happen. And the reason why I believe it's happened is because if it hadn't, we wouldn't be here talking about it. Unfortunately, we know that we human beings can be just horrific, can be the worst monsters that you can imagine. But at the same time, we can also be the most noble and the most loving and the most inspirational. And as long as we keep responding with a greater amount of love and inspiration in the face of hate, whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, what have you, I'm an optimist. There's a principle in Sikhi called Chardikala, which is what this says in Punjabi. And Chardikala means relentless optimism. It means that throughout your existence, for good, bad, and especially ugly, doesn't matter what's happening in the world, everything in the world is a divine creation to be grateful for at every moment. And I saw the Sikh community demonstrate this after the Gurdwara in Oak Creek was attacked. It's the exact same thing that the Jewish community in Pittsburgh demonstrated. It's the exact same thing that the Black community in Charleston, South Carolina demonstrated. It's to say we're not going to give up our faith in humanity. We're not going to stop loving each other. In fact, we're going to crank that up in response to your hatred. And so I think that's what we need to do now. I do think that, just being real, that the uncertainty that COVID introduced in our society makes a very ripe breeding ground for hate and conspiracy. We as human beings don't like not knowing things. We want to be certain about things. So when there's really complex, crazy stuff happening in the world, and somebody comes along with a ridiculous but very well packaged and simple conspiracy theory about why things are happening, it's just like a natural mechanism to be like, okay, yeah, I want to adopt that, because now I don't have the uncertainty anymore. So combat that with the certainty of love, of spiritual human love for one another, and I see it work every single day, and I know it can continue to work.
Thank you. We're going to take two more questions. This is also a combination of questions. A lot of people are asking. They said, you mentioned that you knew Jews, you weren't necessarily anti-Semitic, but it was more of the rush. Did you feel that your friends in the movement, did they feel the same way? And when you left, did others leave?
So that I heard a phrase. There's a great theater group in Chicago called Collaboration, and they did a running play about the history of violence in Chicago, like going back hundreds of years, and it was really powerful. And in that play, I heard the phrase "hurt people hurt people." That truth, that violence comes from suffering, is such a potent weapon against violence and a weapon against hate. Because when you see someone being violent and hateful, rather than having every right in many cases to be violent and hateful back, you can say they're doing that because they're hurting. And that doesn't mean you roll over. It doesn't mean you let people walk all over you. I'm not a pacifist. If somebody physically attacks me, I'll physically defend myself. If somebody else needs to be defended, I will defend them. But even in the act of when you have to degenerate to using force, you remind yourself that this is happening because this person is suffering. It's not because they're a monster. It's not because they're inherently evil. It's because they're a human being who has been through trauma that they haven't processed in a healthy way, and that makes them act this way. That just saying hurt people to yourself can remind you of that. And it's an amazing asset that I encourage you all to adopt. I see that because every single person I've ever met not just in my neo-Nazi days, but in my contemporary work in counter-violent extremism, of every violent extremist background you could think of, has had some sort of trauma in their life that broke them and led them to the point where they want to hurt other people. So all the guys that I knew in my skinhead gangs, and my best friend who went to prison, he had a horrific childhood. Last time he saw his dad, he was beating his 6-year-old brother like a grown man, and he never saw him again. He was 4. His mom was a heroin addict. He grew up around violence and drugs and guns and poverty, and like you would expect, you wouldn't be, not expect, but you wouldn't be surprised to see someone with that background go so wrong. And that was more often the case than my background's kind of an outlier that I had trauma in my childhood, but it was relatively minor and it was very underneath the surface. For the second part of the question, the bulk of people I knew back then have gotten out and have changed their lives one way or another. Some more than others. There are some I know who still harbor some racist principles, but they're not engaged. They're not an affiliated member of hate groups, and they all have like softened their ideology to the point where they would have friends who aren't white or friends who are Jewish. You can't keep that up very long. There's if you're in any kind of violent extremist group, you're going to get killed. You're going to go to prison. You're going to get out, or you're going to stay in and like live this horrific, bitter, loveless life for the rest of your existence. Of those 4 options, the last one to me is the least appealing. And most people find themselves in that third option where they get out. Now, do they go 180 like I do and become activists? A lot of people do. And a lot of people do it and do amazing work. A lot of people do it and maybe they shouldn't do it because they're not cut out for it. But it's kind of a natural thing because as twisted as it sounds, people in violent extremist groups, they think they're doing something good. As hateful as I would have told you that I was doing it to save the white race, which is in danger of extinction. Like I was fully bought into that. So if you can take those people and say, hey, actually, do you want a way you can really help people? Like come help us gather PPE for hospital workers. Like come help us. We're gonna help feed homeless people. I do a lot of work with veterans now. Like we're gonna help homeless veterans get on their feet. Like introduce a really like valid, real means of doing something good in the world, and they'll typically leap at it. But that's also a reason why a lot of people will be like, hey, I want to be an activist, I want to speak. And for some people that's great. For some people it's maybe not the right option. Some people just kind of get on with their lives. So there's all kinds of things in between there.
Thank you so much. And this is going to be our last question, and then I'll explain after. But for the last question, it's something you and I have spoken about, and a lot of people are asking, what is, and combining a little, what is your education now on the Holocaust? Did you have to go back and learn or relearn? And have you met with Holocaust survivors in the past?
Right. And as we talked about on our prep call, and I'm humiliated to admit this, but we looked at Kristallnacht as like a holiday. It was a time to like celebrate and get drunk. And we saw Kristallnacht as the day that the German people rose up and said they had enough. It was this like ridiculous, twisted romanticization of a horrific, hateful, violent riot, and that's how we looked upon it back then. Since then, I've actually become a genocide scholar of sorts. As I mentioned, I've been to Auschwitz. I was there at the invite of the supervisor of the guides, and just talking to him. He gave me a personal tour of Auschwitz, which I was very grateful for. But you don't even think about this until you go there. But he was like, "Can you imagine this being your job 8 hours a day?" every day, like leading people on these tours. And you can't go numb and you can't lose your mind. Like you have to maintain this balance to where you're like awake and aware and connected to everything that's happened here, but not lose your mind and not just shut off. Like and I'm still just awed at people who can do that work. And this man whose job was to support all these people doing the work, and he had done that work himself. I've had kind of a drive to bear witness to human suffering, and I think it's a response to the time in my life when I created human suffering, and so that's a lot of what brought me to Auschwitz. I've done work with Holocaust survivors. There's a great org here in Wisconsin called the Holocaust Education Resource Center. It's affiliated with our local JCC. I've done a ton of work with them over the years. We've organized events where we would bring middle school and high school kids to come and hear the stories of Holocaust survivors. As I'm sure everyone is really well aware, just time marching on, there are fewer and fewer people who have firsthand knowledge of the Holocaust. And so it's so important to listen to them and to preserve those stories and to see that other people hear those stories as well. Beyond my experience studying the Holocaust, I have a number of friends who are survivors of the Rwandan genocide. I've done a lot of work with them, listening to their stories and hearing about how that genocide happened. I've been to Srebrenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina, have worked with survivors of the genocide there. I've been to Utøya Island, where Anders Breivik murdered 69 kids, most of them, most of them teenagers, excuse me. The day, as soon as the shooting at Emmanuel AME happened, Pardeep, who lost his father in Oak Creek, and I and Pardeep's brother Amardeep, and a small film crew piled in the Par Suburban and drove down there. So we were down at Emmanuel AME about 36 hours after the shooting. It's important to me to bear witness to that suffering and to offer myself in service to help any way I can, and that's a big driver for what I do.
Thank you so much. We can't thank you enough for joining us here today and speaking with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. You can always reach out to us. Also wanted to let everybody know that Arno has 2 books. One, My Life After Hate. I just finished reading before this. Is excellent. I highly recommend it. And Arno, we look forward to welcoming you to our community one day in person, hopefully sooner rather than later. And we put all this behind us. And once again, thank you all for joining us and for commemorating Kristallnacht. Have a wonderful evening.